Okay, hey guys. Today I'm going to be presenting On Die Musik by Franz Schubert, so a little historical background. It was composed by Schubert in March of 1817, and it was set to a poem by Franz von Schober. The words On Die Musik directly translates to music, and the words of this song and the poem are describing one's love for music. Schubert dedicated the piece to a Viennese man who was a pianist by the name of Albert Sawinski. He actually dedicated it to him 10 years after he wrote it when the piece was published in 1827, and it was published as Opus 88, song number 4, and it was cataloged by Deutsch as D547. So just looking at the piece, skimming through it, you see it's pretty short. There aren't any modulations. It stays in D major throughout the piece. But one thing, the phrases are actually all pretty different, and it's not very symmetrical. Nothing lines up very much, and you'll see what I mean here in a moment. So my crudely drawn rainbows that I have here are just highlighting the phrase structure a little bit. Let me get my pointer. So the piece, I called it as ABCD form. All of the phrases are different enough that I consider them completely different phrases with no real variation on each other, although they do have a similar contour. And then also there is a 2-bar prelude to the piece and a 4 to 5 bar postlude to the piece. So starting out, you have our 2-bar prelude right here. And then I'll talk more about the Roman numerals in just a moment. But then moving on, we have our A section, which is this orange line right here. One thing that's really important to note with this piece is that the rhythms and the melodies change quite a bit throughout the piece, even as short as it is, but it's the contour of the piece that really matters here. So if you look, we have ascending motion right here, followed by a large leap downwards, which then leads into running eighth notes, which leads into the tonic chord. And then moving on to the B section, you'll see it's a pretty similar phrase structure. Ascending motion followed by a large leap downwards, running eighth notes into your tonic chord right here, and then we move on to have a nice chromatic bass line and a half cadence point. But you'll see that throughout this piece that the contour is what really matters to Schubert. So then moving on to our C section here, you have pretty similar thing here, only the music is higher now. We get to some climax moments. You have ascending motion, large leap downwards, running eighth notes into your tonic chord. This is a first mini climax, I like to call it, right here. And then finally moving into our last phrase. Our last phrase actually repeats some of the words in the middle of the phrase. So our last phrase is 5 bars, while the rest of them were 4 bars. But last phrase, you'll see the contour is, it's actually ascending the whole time. I'll talk a little bit more about that later when I talk about the word painting, but it's ascending because this is the first major climax of the piece, and it happens in both the times that the piece is sang through. You'll see there's a repeat right here. And then finally, at the end of this, you have your 4 to 5 bar postlude. So moving on, just talking about the Roman numerals a little bit, where the piece changes so much harmonically, I think what's really important to note isn't the function necessarily of all the chords, but the motion of all the chords. So if you'll look right here, the soprano part of the piano, or the right hand you could say, is eighth notes the entire time, mostly block chords, nothing interesting really happening. But in the bass line you have nice chromatic movement, especially right here. You have your 1/6 to 6. That's actually a 7 half diminished 7 of 5, which then moves to your 5. Finishes out that phrase. Not much happening in the bass there, but then you get to your second phrase and you'll see that you have a lot of rising motion in the bass. And then that finally finishes off at this half cadence point that I was talking here. It actually, the tension that was built up right here, it actually then releases that tension as the line starts moving downwards. And this is where you start getting some of your interesting chords, like your 7 diminished 7 of 6, or your 7 diminished of 5 is what that actually is. So you start getting some interesting chords like that with the passing tone. Moving on, you'll see that your bass line moves downwards. This is actually opposite of what's happening in the soprano line. The soprano line is mostly building tension right now, while the bass is releasing tension in the piano. These measures right here repeat. You see this, he changes it slightly rhythmically, but it's the same idea in the bass line. And then finally you get to our D section, which starts right here. And you'll see that the bass point is slowly, chromatically moving upwards until you finally get to your climax, which is right here, right on a 5-6-5 of 6 chord. You'll see you're getting a lot of secondary dominance right here, like a 5-6-5 of 4, a 7 diminished 7 of 5, a 5-6-5 of 6, a 7 diminished 7 of 5 again. And so that is one thing that's interesting about this piece, is that all Schubert really cares about is the contour of the parts, and he uses that to build the chords of his piece. So then moving on, just talk about some of the word painting that Schubert uses. So the words for the first 2 lines of the piece, I'm not going to read them to you, but they're pretty subdued. They're dark. They're not quite exciting or uplifting in any way. But then you finally get to this yellow section right here, and the words are, "Have you ignited my heart with a more ardent love?" So when it starts using words like ignited, you'll see that's when it reaches that first mini climax that I was talking about. And then the second time around, it says, "The heaven of better times to me has opened," or it's basically saying that music has opened a time of heaven for Schober, the writer of the poem of this piece, which is why Schubert actually put in this ascending motion right here to give that feeling, that uplifting feeling. So then moving on to our D section, the first verse, the words are, "Have you borne me away to a better world?" So that's why there's ascending motion right here. It's talking about the feeling of rising, the feeling of ascension that the music gives you, and that's why you hit this climax as you're transported to a new world. And then I like to think of this last repeated section as a kind of reminiscent moment where you're reminiscing on how music feels to you, and that's actually why it's lower, it's more subdued, it's not quite as shining as the climax right before it. And then the last line of the song, this is the second verse, "You lovely art, I thank to you for that." So again, just a climax moment. He's thanking music for what it's done for him, and that's why Schubert wrote it as a climax point right here. So then last thing to talk about, just some performance issues with this. This is a pretty easy piece. There's some occasional jumps, like right here you see we have a 7th jump or a 6th jump. That would be hard to work up, but with practice that would come to any singer. The really hard thing about this is that, like I said, the harmonic context changes pretty often in this piece, and also the phrase structure changes a lot in this piece. Even though they're 4-bar phrases, they're not symmetric with each other. They don't match each other. They're 4 separate phrases that you have to weave into one piece of music. So I feel like that would pose a challenge in terms of memorizing and then trying to have a cohesive, fluent story that you're telling with your music. So I feel like those are a couple of the challenges with this piece. I hope that you have enjoyed my presentation, and I hope you enjoy listening to Franz Schubert's On to Music. Thank you.